Right. Got people back there. Let's open up to Matthew 24 as we get started, continuing kind of where we left off last week. If you remember, we're kind of just tracing some of the, looking at some different passages about Israel and their future. We looked at some Old Testament passages last week. We looked at Daniel chapter 9, which indicates that at the time of the Messiah, the people of the prince that shall come, and so remember, it's the people of the prince are going to destroy the city and the sanctuary. And then the prince that is coming will establish a covenant with the Jews for 1 week, in which the midst of that week, he will cause the sacrifices to cease and commit the abomination of desolations, which several passages indicate is not the destruction of the temple, but the rededication of the temple to the worship of the Antichrist. And so there's several passages that show that. And so we saw Daniel. So we understand that the destruction of the temple took place in 70 AD, and that was destroyed by the Romans, the people of the prince that shall come. And then the last 70 weeks obviously happened sometime later. And with that, as we look at that last 70 week, or that last week there, or the last 7 years, the temple needs to be rebuilt. And the Jews need to be in the land practicing their sacrifices in order for the Antichrist or the person to come, the prince that is going to come to cause it to cease. And so we expect that they will be living in the land, that the temple will be rebuilt, and that they will be carrying out sacrifices according to the Old Testament laws best they can. And so will that happen before Christ, before the rapture, before we leave? Will some of the temple be rebuilt? Will we see that happen? I don't know. Will it happen? Will there be some sort of interim period in which the temple is rebuilt? A lot of questions there, but we do expect that to happen. And so the Jewish people's return to the land, their desire to rebuild their temple, the expectation that maybe the temple will be rebuilt. They're standing at the wall daily, crying and wailing there for their temple, is all pointing towards things the Bible prophesies. And then we looked at Ezekiel, and so there is an enemy within, somebody that's going to make a peace treaty with them and then attack them. And then in Ezekiel, we looked at some enemies without, Gog, Magog, and then it went through a number of different groups. And I was doing a little bit of research, and I think I'm going to maybe do a whole lesson on Gog, Magog, and who these groups are, because it's actually it answers in Genesis or creation.com. One of them goes through the table of nations, and Gog and Magog, they're mentioned in the table of nations. It was grandson of Noah, and the dispersion of these different people is well attested to in history. This is not like guesswork. This is not people just, it's well attested to, and there's plenty of evidence, historical evidence for who these people were and where they lived. And so when we say it's the region of Russia and the Ukraine, or we say that this people's Iran, that's not guesswork, and so it's well established, and it's well documented in history who these people are and where they settled and who's being talked about there. And so we expect a coalition of Russians as well as a number of the Muslim countries to come against Israel. That's Gog and all of those others. We have very similar coalition today. Russia is in partnership with a lot of the Muslim countries. Of course, the Muslim countries want Israel destroyed. And so then you have enemies from without that are going to attack the nation. So there's some of the things that we looked at last week. As we continue in the New Testament now, we come to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24 is not the Sermon on the Mount. It is the Olivet Discourse. And Christ is going to talk about some end time expectations, or some expectations for Israel, and expectations for the temple, expectations for the Jewish people. And so we want to look at these, Matthew chapter 24. And in this, as we look at the history and the Jews, Jesus prophesied that there will be events that will happen, that many of the events and the events prophesied by Daniel will happen after the gospel of the kingdom has been preached around the world. And so when did Christ expect the 70th week of Daniel to take place? The abomination of desolation. When did Christ say that all this was going to take place? Well, in Matthew chapter 24 and Luke chapter 21, we have Christ answering that question when he expects it to take place. In Matthew chapter 24, he's going to say, after the gospel of Jesus Christ, the gospel of the kingdom has been preached around the world. In Luke chapter 21, he's going to say, after the time of the Gentiles is over. And he gives us very specific times as to when these things happen. And so let's take a look at Matthew chapter 24, and then we'll look into Luke chapter 21 to see these things as we read here. So, and several times we will we'll hear this idea of the times of the Gentiles, or the gospel going forth to the Gentiles. Romans chapter 11 talks about that, right? Romans chapter 11, the Gentiles are grafted in. The natural branches are cut off. But the time of the Gentiles, when the gospel is going forth to the Gentiles, and God is working in a dynamic way with the Gentiles. But what does Romans 11 talk about? It also talks about the time when the Jews will be grafted back in. And it talks about what will the salvation of the Jews be, but our resurrection from the dead. And so Paul is expecting a time of the Gentiles where the Gentiles are grafted in as a prime aspect of God's program, with the Jews coming back. And so we looked at those things when we were in Romans chapter 11, but there's an amazing amount of consistency in Scripture on these things. All right, Matthew chapter 24. We'll go ahead and read down through verse 15 here, just to kind of get it all at one read here. Then Jesus went out, Matthew 24, verse 1, then Jesus went out and departed from the temple. And his disciples came up to show him the building of the temple. And so the disciples are amazed. It's the temple that Herod has been building. And Herod has been building this amazing temple for what I think it's a 40-year project. And so they're amazed at what Herod has done here. And it's not quite finished yet, I don't think. I didn't actually look into that, but I don't think it's quite finished yet at this point, but it's getting close to done. Verse 2, and Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. And so they see this, and they're amazed by the temple structure. And understand, when he says not one stone left upon another, he's not talking about little tiny blocks. All the stones, they're massive stones that they've laid a foundation. And not one of these stones is going to be left on top of another when all is done. And so he tells them of the destruction of this temple that they're so impressed by. And Jesus says it's going to be knocked down. A prophecy which Jesus made in his life was fulfilled in 70 AD. All right, verse 3. Now, as he went to the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us when all these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age. And Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no one deceive you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. And he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Therefore, when you see the abominations of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, notice the word, you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by standing in the holy place. Very specific. The abomination is standing up in the holy place. Whoever reads, let him understand. The abomination of desolation is not the destruction of the temple. It's an abomination that is standing up in the holy place. Then let those who are in Judea flee into the mountains. And it continues there. So some who understand, some modern interpreters of this passage understand that this entire passage takes place in 70 AD. And that this whole Matthew chapter 24 is talking about the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. And therefore, later on in the passage, when it talks about Jesus coming in the sky and establishing his kingdom, they would see all of that as figurative language. And so this is a fairly common interpretation, especially among those that would be post-millennial. They would say that Jesus established his kingdom in 70 AD, and Jesus' kingdom on earth is established in the church through his rule and reign over the church, and Jesus is king, and he came as king in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple. And so that would be a common interpretation in this day and age of Matthew chapter 24. We would understand that all of this is yet future. Well, not all of it. The aspect of the destruction of the temple is not future. But what Christ is talking about here is future, that the Christ coming in the clouds is a literal action, and that he comes and he becomes king to sit and rule and reign on the throne. So we'll work our way through this. Verses 1 and 2 of the chapter talk about the destruction of the temple, which we do understand happened in 70 AD. And literally not one stone was left upon another. They gave that very specific command. I don't want any of it standing left. And so that happened in 70 AD, and we understand that to be the case. With that statement, though, now the disciples, you know how something gets your mind going? In a statement like the temple being destroyed can kind of bring up all kinds of questions. Like, wait a minute, well, if the temple is destroyed, here we have Jesus, the Messiah, we have our king, but the temple is going to be destroyed. What about the kingdom? What about all of these things? Yeah. Breathe. What about all these things? And so it produces a lot of questions about a lot of different things. And so they're going to ask questions about all of these different things. And do we have all of the questions they ask here, or is this just a sampling of some of the questions? But in verse 3, because he's talked about the destruction of the temple, they start asking questions. So verse 3, now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us when these things be. And so that question references back to what? Probably. When are these things going to be? Probably the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. He's just told them that the temple is going to be destroyed. So they ask a question about that. And then, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And so they're asking different questions. These two things don't have to be the same time. They're just asking different questions about all of the questions that are going through their mind. So when's the destruction of the temple going to be? And then, well, what is the sign of your coming and the end of this age? And so it's not the end of the world. The Greek there can mean just age. When is this age, this time period going to end and the new one begin? When's the new age going to begin? And you're going to come. And so they're just asking general questions here. They're asking more than just about the destruction of the temple. They want to know how the destruction of the temple fits in with his coming again and his return. And, the destruction of the temple, and it sounds like this age and his return is not going to be for a while. And so we have a number of questions here. Would the disciples have associated the destruction of the temple with the end of the age or with the coming to establish Jesus' kingdom? Probably not if they understood Daniel. And maybe they didn't understand the prophecy of Daniel yet. But what's Daniel say? The people of the prince that is going to come. will destroy the temple and the city. Not the prince himself. And then in the 70th week, there's going to be a covenant. And so they're just, again, these questions are all about the future. They're kind of trying to understand the destruction of the temple as it concerns the kingdom and the establishment of the kingdom. And so they don't necessarily have to think that these things are related, because some people understanding this passage would say this entire passage is about the destruction of Jerusalem. And it's talking about one time period. But there's different things going on here. There's the destruction of the temple, and there's Jesus coming back in the end of the age. And so Jesus begins to discuss and answer these questions. Do we have the complete answer of Jesus at this point? Well, I think as we get into Luke chapter 21, we're going to see that probably Matthew is recording certain aspects of Jesus' response, and Luke records some different thoughts. And so Matthew focuses on some things here, and there's similar things, but there's different aspects that are stressed here. But we'll see that. And so Jesus begins to respond, and he begins with a warning. The first thing he's going to do is tell them, don't be deceived. So verses 4 through 6. Jesus answered and said unto them, take heed that no one deceive you. And this will be in response to his coming again, the end of the age and his coming. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, and the end is not yet. And so he says, don't be deceived. Number one thing here he starts out is don't let anybody deceive you. What might they be deceived about? Well, that Jesus has come. He says, don't be deceived when people say that they're the Messiah, that they've come. And he's going to give them, by the end of this, a very specific way to know when he's come. And so he says, until you see this, don't be deceived. I haven't come back yet. It hasn't happened. All right, so don't let anybody deceive you when they come in my name and say, I am the Christ. They're going to deceive a lot, but don't you be deceived by them. Also, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, don't let these things trouble you. And I think this is talking about in general. Anytime a war starts up, anytime there's a battle, anytime there's a fight, there's, people get uptight. People think, oh, this is it. And he said, don't let wars and rumors of wars upset you. These things are going to come to pass. And it's also a time where there might be easy deception in times of fear and worry. And so he warns them not to be deceived by claims that Christ has come, and not to be deceived just because there's wars and rumors of wars. In verses 7 through 13, there's any number of ways to understand these. I think in verse 7, he starts describing maybe some of the end time things that would be an indication that things are getting close. And so wars and rumors of wars are not an indication that things are getting close. But maybe some of these things are an indication that things are building towards that end times. Verse 7, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And so that's describing a special kind of war. And many people associate that with World War I, World War II, possibly there, but it's talking about a major war on a grand scale. And so it's different than verse 6. Most likely. And so nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. And so he's talking about this special war with these famines and these pestilence and these earthquakes in new places, in different places. And these are the beginning. This is an indication that maybe things are coming. Then they will deliver you up for tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And many will be offended, will betray one another, and will be hated one of another. Then many false prophets will rise and deceive many. And so they're rising up of a lot of false prophets with great deception. Because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. He who endures to the end shall be saved. And so probably some description of things taking place at the end times. Increased war at greater escalation, greater levels. Increased earthquake and natural disasters, then increased persecution of Christians, of believers, There is immorality on a greater level, a greater scale. And so some of these things are happening. Then verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. And so we have that indication of one of the things that is going to happen. The gospel of Jesus Christ is going to be preached around the world to all nations. And again, those that want to make this about 70 AD will say, well, that meant all the known world of the day. And so by 70 AD, the gospel is spread around much of Europe, Asia, and Africa, much of the known world of the day. And so that would be their understanding and how they apply this to 70 AD. And I think, again, I mean, you can do a lot messing around with scripture here, I guess, and interpretation, but I don't think that's what's indicated here, and especially as you get into Luke, I really don't think that's what's indicated. But he says the gospel is going to be preached around the world. And those who want to make this about 70 AD and the destruction of the temple, and thus have no future for the Jewish people, have a struggle with this verse, because it says that the gospel of the kingdom will be preached around the world. And then he says, and again, the concept of the time of the Gentiles. Therefore, based on this, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. And so he gives very specific, he designates the abomination of desolations spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Again, that is defined for us in Daniel chapter 12. It's defined for us in 2 Thessalonians. It is not the destruction of the temple. It is when the temple is rededicated to the worship of the Antichrist. And so 2 Thessalonians says, when he stands in the temple of God and is worshipped as God in the holy place, and he raises up an idol to himself. And this is what Antiochus Epiphanes did a couple hundred years before Christ, and was a precursor, a figure of the Antichrist. He didn't destroy the temple. He went in the temple and offered a pig on the altar and desecrated the temple. And so the abomination, and then let's see, 2 Thessalonians. I'll turn there real quick and read those verses, because I think it's very important we understand this. This is a common interpretation of the passage that is going around in church, in the church today. It says this, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3, let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Okay, that's the abomination of desolations. And again, the wording of Matthew is very specific. When you see that abomination standing up in the holy place, not when you see the temple leveled, but when you see this abomination in the holy place, then let him who reads understand. And so I think, again, the scriptures are very consistent on the abomination of desolation, what the Daniel prophecy is about. And so Daniel chapter 9 says the people of the prince that is going to come will destroy the temple and the city. But when the prince comes, what's he going to do? He's going to make a covenant for 77 years. And in the midst of that, he's going to break that covenant, and he's going to raise up the abomination that makes desolate. He's going to rededicate the temple to the worship of himself. Let's see. I might as well turn there. Daniel chapter 12 talks about this as well. Daniel 12, verse 11. And from that time that the daily sacrifices is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. And so he talks about the abomination of desolation is set up in the temple. And Matthew talks about it standing, and Paul talks about it being him being in the temple, being worshipped as God in the temple. So very specific here about what's going to happen. And so Jesus, he speaks of the abomination of desolation, and then he goes on and talks then about what we would understand to be the Great Tribulation. Probably maybe the first aspect was talking about the first 3 years, and there was some very difficult times, but then after this, there's going to be increased persecution. So verse 16, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetops not go down to take anything out of his house. Let him who is in the field go not back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babes in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. Unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Then if anyone, and so he says, remember the Antichrist, this prince that's going to come, makes a covenant with them for 7 years. Halfway through, he breaks that covenant. So for the first 3.5 years, the Jews are living at least at peace with the Antichrist, despite all that's going on. After that, he breaks the covenant. He rededicates the temple to himself. The abomination of desolation is standing in the holy place. The temple is dedicated to his worship, and then he begins a persecution that is intense against the Jewish people. Then Jesus speaks of a time of increased deception, verses 23 through 26. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. Of course, we believe that we will be gone by this point, according to our end time understandings. For false Christ and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if it were possible, even the elect. See, I've told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he's in the desert, do not go out. Look, he is in the inner room, do not believe it. And so he says, don't believe anybody that tells you Christ is here, Christ is there, or they are the Christ because they're working great signs and wonders. This is how I'm going to come. Verse 27, for as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Again, and so he talks very specifically about his coming. In verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the heaven. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So those that want to make this passage about 70 AD have to take this passage of Scripture and spiritualize a lot of what's being said. To think that this is some sort of spiritual coming of Christ as King of Kings and Lord of Lords that he did in 70 AD. And in fact, Christ warns us not to be deceived. And I do believe there are many brothers and sisters in Christ who have this understanding, yet I wish they understood this passage right, the coming of Christ and what it means here. And so in this passage, again, very specifically, he tells us that the gospel is going to go to all nations of the world, and it preached around the world. And then these things are going to begin, then the abomination of desolation, then the great tribulation, and then the coming of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Yeah. All right. We'll save Luke chapter 21 for next week. A lot of the same things, but some different stuff there in Luke chapter 21 as we work our way through that. So, any comments, questions?
I read something about the red heifer has returned.
Yes. Yeah. Aaron wrote that, right? Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. It was Aaron's little passage. Yeah. So the red heifer has come back. And again, the Jewish people are anticipating building their temple.
It was blessed by the
Yeah.
priest.
The red heifer was, yeah. It's got to be a couple years old.
Yep.
And then, so they're waiting for it to get old enough, but they've got the red heifer. They've got certain ones that meet the criteria. Yeah. So, and then, they're looking to rebuild their temple. They're anticipating these things. And so, very specific. And again, I feel, those within Christianity that just have walked away from the future of Israel and what Israel is supposed to mean and Israel's place in God's plan. Again, God said, you are my witnesses. You are my witnesses. And we're going to look at not this Sunday, but next Sunday, we're going to look at the last 3 verses that Paul quotes there. Four passages he quotes. He tells the Gentiles to rejoice in Israel's salvation. The Old Testament passages where the Gentiles are told, rejoice in Israel's salvation. Rejoice in Israel's salvation. Rejoice in Israel's salvation. Why? Because our salvation is tied to theirs, because our future is tied to their futures. God is going to bless all nations of the world through Israel. They are his witnesses to confirm the truth of his word. And so, very important we get these things right. So. Prayer praise items this evening. Continue to pray for Kurt. Had some difficult news yesterday concerning his foot. So still not quite healing like it should. And so I'll be praying for him. Possibility there of home antibiotics administered through an IV. So, and anyway, just a lot going on with them. So pray for Kurt. At least 6 more weeks. So just a lot going on there. Other things. Got VBS next week. I think we had good exposure at the Strawberry Festival. Very excited for a good Strawberry Festival, good opportunity to reach out to the community there. We've got Brains and the Bible with us on Sunday. It's Brains and Bibles. No? I can never remember how he says that. Brains and Bible. Yeah. Joe Willoughby, for his ministry.
Lego VBS is coming up soon.
Oh, yes. Yeah, all right. The Snell's doing the Lego VBS. Is it dinosaur or Lego VBS cooler, Katie? It's a toss-up, isn't it? All right. Oh, yeah.
And they had some sickness. Leah was sick yesterday.
Oh, no.
Passed through a lot of it. So that's not so good.
All right. Pray for those that are sick on the mission trip.
My brother.
Yeah. Roger has COVID. Pray for him. And influenza. Still going around, so pray for that. Camps are coming up. Keep those in your prayers. We got 6 kids currently going to camp, junior camp. So. Oh, yeah. Living water and the camp cooler there. Pray for Gary and Judy. Saw them today. They'd like to get out. They're hoping to get out to church maybe this Sunday. I haven't seen them in a while. So.
Word on Evan.
He is home. All the scans came back fairly normal. He is, they've told him to kind of take it easy for a few days, but they don't really have any answers for him yet.
So they didn't have to do it.
They didn't do any, yeah, he was in the hospital until yesterday. He came home yesterday, so he's in for quite a while. But they, as far as I know, they never found anything specific for him. So told him to take it easy. Yeah.
We had a good trip, except Jerry passed out.
Okay.
New prayers there.
All right, Jerry.
Talked to him this morning, and then they pretty close since June first.
Okay. Yeah.
So his wife isn't letting him.
Yeah. Uh-oh. We won't ask how that's going.
Not too bad for him.
Yeah. Yeah. For who? Keep them both in there.
Rachel, she's the one I drive for on a regular basis, had hysterectomy day. All I know is she had to go to Iowa City because it requires a specialist. There's a minimum of a 10-week recovery.
Oh, wow.
So, prayer request that everything feels like it should, but also praise I need to work at Q for the next 10 weeks instead of having to go to someone. Just 11 beer on me.
Kylie's coworker, Rachel, hysterectomy, 10 weeks recovery, so pray for her. Kylie's also glad to be at Keosauqua instead of going to Toma all the time. So it's a blessing for her. Anything
Ray and
else?
Laura headed
Okay.
to Michigan Saturday for their
Okay.
classes, seminar, whatever, training. And then they're bringing Alexa.
Yeah, Alexa's coming home. Okay. So pray for Clay and Laura as they go to Michigan for training for mission work with Send, and then pray for Alexa. She comes home and prays there. All right. Anything? Bill Koister continues to have health needs.
Yeah, he's coming tomorrow.
Oh, is he? Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Pray for Bill as he travels.
Be here for a week. Something like that.
All right. Anything else tonight? Specifically?
He had his chemo on Monday.
Okay.
It doesn't seem to affect him too bad just during it.
Okay.
He drove to his sister's the next day. So
Well, good. Good. Anything else tonight?
Kelly had a safe trip to Florida. They're back today. Barely finished the trailer. I didn't.
Beverly had mentioned that Bates was not doing too good.
Yeah, I think just general there, Evangeline. A lot of health needs. Anything else? Well, let's go ahead then and divide up for prayer.